The Cleveland Browns are in a bit of a predicament because with one of the most talented rosters in the NFL from head to toe, this team should be able to compete for championships. Yet year after year, nothing has worked out, and every single year it just feels like another wasted year. So today, I want to talk about the Cleveland Browns and why this may potentially be their year to win the AFC. Now, the way we're going to be breaking this down is by breaking it up into two different segments. Why this team could win the AFC and why this team maybe won't. And at the very end, I'll give you guys my unbiased opinion of whether or not I think this Browns team is going to be any good next year. Let's talk about it. So when talking about this Cleveland Browns team, it's very important that we first acknowledge all the injuries they had last year. Guys like Nick Chubb, Deshaun Watson, half their offensive line, several defensive pieces missed a lot of critical time in the regular season that would ultimately affect their postseason. So one of the biggest improvements of this team last year heading into next year is they're going to be fully healthy. They've missed a lot of time from last year and now have a full offseason to heal, and hopefully by the beginning of training camp and the beginning of the preseason, we'll be able to see some of these stars play again. Again, let's not downplay the amount of injuries this team had because it was star after star after star, yet they still made it to the playoffs and had a very successful year. The next thing I like about this team is they have a very good coach, a guy who's won some Coach of the Years at this point. Do I think that he's a guy who could lead this team to a championship? It's hard to say because we've seen him at times get a bit outplayed, especially in the playoffs. But what I will say is it's hard to really judge him off of last year's performance when you had so many injuries. But despite everything that this team went through, they still had a very successful season, and I think a big part of it is because of the coaching staff. I think with a healthy roster and this level of coaching staff, I think you're going to see this team take some steps forward next year into becoming potentially that championship team we think they can be. The next thing I like about this team is I think they have a lot of really good personnel on this roster. I could bury it down into saying that this position group is good and this position group is good, but I think that would be a little bit too simple to say when the overall roster is very solid. Looking in the receiving room, you have guys like Amari Cooper, Jerry Jeudy, Elijah Moore, Cedric Tillman, and I really like Jamari Thrash. The tight end room is stout with David Njoku. When healthy, your offensive line is one of the best in the NFL with guys like Jedrick Wills, Joel Bitonio, Ethan Pochich, Wyatt Teller, and Jack Conklin. When you look at this defense, you have stars like Myles Garrett, Zadarius Smith, Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, Denzel Ward, Greg Newsome, Juan Thornhill. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. When you look at the roster from up to down, it's really hard to say what positions are really bad. Now, am I saying that every single one of these players are top 5 or top 10 in their position? No, but I would say there's a couple that probably are in that conversation. So all in all, personnel-wise, coaching-wise, there's a lot to be happy about with this team. But then that brings us to the opposite of this thing. Why this team may not be the team that we think they can be. And usually I spend more times on the positive, but I think it's very easy to summarize all the positives for this team. I think it's more important that we talk about why this team may fall back into not being that championship contender. And we have to start off with the obvious, the health. This is kind of an older roster with a lot of veterans to guys who have been coming off of injuries. And usually what ends up happening is after one injury, you end up having another, and then another, and then another, and then eventually you end up retiring. It just seems to be the cycle for a lot of players. Now, I'm hoping that doesn't happen for this Browns team because all the guys that suffered injuries last year are very freaking good players. So of course, I don't want those guys to sustain injuries consistently over and over again. But that was the reason why they didn't do much last year. And I think that if they aren't able to do much this year, we can potentially look back and say, well, injuries screwed them over again. I hate to make this comparison, but they're kind of like the New Orleans Pelicans or the LA Clippers of the NFL. Whereas like they have all this talent and every single player is really solid, but they just get injured at the worst time imaginable and they don't have guys to replace them with. It also doesn't help when you don't have the draft picks to fill in for those positions. They didn't have a first round pick. Their first pick was Michael Hall Jr. and I did not like that pick at all. Now, obviously the bench players are good enough to get the job done, but it's really hard to replace injury-filled, somewhat older players when you don't have a first round pick. Now, them not having a first round pick is not me saying that this team isn't going to win a championship because they don't have their first round pick. Don't get it twisted. And I think overall they actually had a couple really nice picks later in the draft like a Jamari Thrash and a Zach Zinter. But my point with that being said is that it's hard to replace your injury-prone players with young, talented players when you don't have a first-round pick. Hopefully that makes sense. So health is a major concern, and it's a concern for every team, but I think for this Browns team, it's even higher. The next question I have is going to be with Deshaun Watson, and I have to point this out. Deshaun Watson has not been very good when he has played. I know that last year was technically his best year with the Browns, but it wasn't really that impressive, and overall, I think there's a lot of better quarterbacks out there. It's really hard to say what Watson can be with this Browns team because we haven't seen it at a consistent rate, and he's also been dealing with injuries basically basically every year. We all know and we all love the Deshaun Watson that was there for the Houston Texans because he was super dominant and one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. But it also comes without saying that that was a long time ago. Hell, 2018 was really his prime. That was 6 years ago to this date. And at this rate, we haven't seen that Deshaun Watson in 3-4+ years. And I just don't know if we're ever going to be able to see that, given one, the system that they run isn't really catered towards Deshaun Watson's strengths, and two, Deshaun Watson just hasn't played very well. Again, I know he got better as time went on, and I think that last year, again, was probably his best year, but there's a lot of better quarterbacks out there, especially in the AFC, where you have guys like Josh Allen, Joe Burrow, Patrick Mahomes, CJ Stroud, Anthony Richardson, so on and so forth. When you stack up Deshaun Watson to those quarterbacks, it's really hard to say that Deshaun is even in the conversation with those guys. And when you're a team as talented as they are, when you don't have a leader or a quarterback who can, one, stay healthy, and two, rise to the occasion to become a playoff riser, it's hard to say that this team has the upside to win a championship. Because you can look at a team, let's say like the Dallas Cowboys, who have consistently struggled to win in the playoffs, and you can point the blame at two things: coaching and quarterback play. But for the Cleveland Browns, you really can't make those same claims because one, we haven't seen Deshaun Watson in the playoffs with this team, but two, the coaching staff is really freaking good. So then you have to point the finger at one guy, and that position arguably should be the quarterback position. Because again, looking up and down this roster, it's extremely talented. But yet again, the quarterback position has continuously failed them with either poor play or injuries. So until I can see a consistent Deshaun Watson that consistently improves and becomes one of the better quarterbacks in the AFC, I can't say this Browns team is going to go to the glory land. And I think 90% of people would agree with me that it's hard to imagine this Browns team winning it all when they have Deshaun Watson at quarterback. And it sucks because you're paying him a lot and you obviously traded for him to get the job done. And I just don't believe nor know if he's able to do that. Beyond that, I think there's other personnel issues, primarily with the running back room, and that's mainly because we don't know what Nick Chubb we're going to be getting after the injury. Let's not act like that injury was anything pretty. It was a broken knee, and it looked as brutal as it sounds. And I love Nick Chubb, and I think that he can come back and still be just as good as he was prior. But it's no kidding, that was one of the most gruesome injuries in the NFL. And when you have a backcourt of Deshaun Watson and Nick Chubb, who are both coming off one, injuries, and two, who knows what we're going to be able to get from them given the inconsistencies they've had. Now, what I will say is behind Nick Chubb, you do have some really good running backs like Jerome Ford, Nyheim Hines, and Deontay Foreman. So I think if Nick Chubb isn't who we think he can be, it's not that big of a deal, but I do have concerns about what level of Nick Chubb we're going to be able to get out of this roster. Next issue I have with this team, and it's going to be my last issue because I think for the most part the personnel is pretty solid, is going to be the level of expectation that Browns fans have. Again, the expectation for this team is to win a championship, and if not that, make a deep playoff run. But in a super talented AFC where every single one of the contenders in the AFC has a top tier quarterback, I just don't know if the Browns have that guy. When you look roster for roster, I think it's a very fair thing to say that the Browns have just as talented, if not more talented roster than some of the other contenders like the Texans. But what this Browns team doesn't have in comparison to the Chiefs or the Bengals or the Texans is a good quarterback. And it sucks to say because I think that this talent is somewhat being wasted by the fact that we just don't know what Deshaun Watson can do when it comes down to being in the playoff time. And before Browns fans roast me in the comment section below, let's be real, if Deshaun Watson was playing in that playoff game against the Texans, they were still losing by 20+. I know Joe Flacco threw some interceptions, but let's be honest, we can be real here, Deshaun Watson wasn't winning that game. And no, I don't think we'd be blaming Deshaun Watson for that loss because the defense gave up like 40, but I do think my point still stands. At the end of the day, it's hard to really trust Deshaun Watson because we don't know what he can be. And when we have seen him on the field, it hasn't really been all that pretty. Has it been bad per se? No, but it hasn't been great. So with that being said, let's now get into my synopsis. I know I've been pretty harsh on the Browns, but I still think this is a borderline playoff team. I say borderline because who knows with the injuries of this team. I think if healthy, they're kind of a lock for the playoffs. If they're not healthy, we'll wait and see. I think with a talented roster and a good coaching staff, this team could easily make it to the first or second round of the playoffs. With a good Deshaun Watson, and it's a big if, they could maybe win a championship. It's hard to say though, because we just don't know what Deshaun Watson can be, and when we have seen him, it hasn't been championship good enough. So that being said, my personal synopsis for the Browns is they're good enough to make the playoffs, they're good enough to even make a deep run in the playoffs, and if Deshaun Watson is who we think they can be, maybe they're a championship contender. But until then, we'll just have to wait and see. But if you did enjoy the video, hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.